All right, let's jump right in. We're about to open a 2,000-year-old letter. Seriously, it was a reply from a guy named Paul to a community in Corinth, a city that was, well, kind of known for being a wild place. They'd sent him some very specific, very personal questions about love, sex, and marriage. So this isn't some dry theological textbook. This is urgent, practical advice for real people with real problems.
So, to really get inside Paul's head, we're going to follow his logic through 5 key movements. We'll kick things off with the very foundation, what marriage is even for. Then we'll get into the tough stuff, like separation and divorce. After that, we'll zoom out to see a huge life principle that applies to everybody, before we zoom back in for some advice to the unmarried. And then we'll wrap it all up with his final thoughts.
Okay, so our journey starts at square one. The folks in Corinth were asking about the absolute fundamentals of relationships, and that's exactly where Paul begins.
He kicks things off in verse 1. And get this, he actually agrees with something they probably said to him. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But, Paul was a realist, so in verse 2, he immediately pivots. He knows that in a city like Corinth, temptation is absolutely everywhere, kind of like this chaotic, raging sea. So he gives some super practical advice. Each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Marriage is that safe island.
Then in verses 3 and 4, Paul drops an idea that was just absolutely radical for his time. Verse 3 sets the stage. A husband and wife should fulfill their marital duty to each other. Okay, makes sense. But verse 4 is the stunner. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I mean, wow. This is a picture of perfect mutual responsibility, like 2 gears that mesh together perfectly, where authority is completely and equally shared.
So, what if a couple wants to take a break for spiritual reasons? Well, verse 5 gives a really clear rule. Don't deprive one another, unless you both agree to it, and only for a short time that you set aside for prayer. And then, come back together. Why? So you're not tempted. The bottom line is, it has to be a yes from both of you, for a short time, for a specific spiritual purpose.
And you can tell Paul is choosing his words really carefully here. In verse 6, he makes this super important distinction. He wants them to know that his advice to marry is a concession, not a direct command from God. This leads right into verse 7, where he explains why. He says he wishes everyone could be single, like him, but he totally gets that each person has their own unique gift from God. Some have the gift of marriage, some have the gift of singleness. Both paths are good.
He wraps up this whole first section in verses 8 and 9, talking directly to the unmarried and widows. In verse 8, he repeats that it's good for them to stay single, just like he is. But then comes the huge but in verse 9. If they can't exercise self-control, they should get married. And his reason is so blunt and practical, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. This visual just nails it, right? Marriage channels that wild, uncontrolled bonfire into the warm, steady light of a fireplace.
And that kind of practical talk about passion leads us right into some of the more difficult and sensitive topics in this letter, separation and divorce, especially when you've got the complication of a mixed faith marriage.
Okay, now notice the shift in authority here for verses 10 and 11. Paul says, "To the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord." Whoa! This isn't his advice anymore. He's saying this is a command. A wife must not separate from her husband, and if she does, she has only 2 options. Stay unmarried or reconcile. The same goes for the husband. The whole point is trying to mend that broken link, not just toss it away.
But then in verse 12, Paul switches back to his own judgment for stuff the Lord didn't directly talk about, like mixed faith marriages. Verses 13 and 14 explain his thinking, and it's fascinating. He says a believer has a sanctifying effect. Just think of it like this candle. Their faith doesn't just stay in one little corner. It pushes back the darkness in the whole room, setting the unbelieving spouse and their children apart in a special way, bringing them into a sphere of God's blessing.
But what if the unbeliever just wants out? Verse 15 gives us really crucial exception. If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. The believing person is not under bondage in that situation. What does that mean? It means they don't have to fight to force the marriage to stay together. God has called us to peace, and if peace means letting go, then you're free. Verse 16 then adds this hopeful little question. You never know, maybe by staying, you might have saved them?
So after all this specific, kind of complicated advice about relationships, it really makes you wonder, right? If our circumstances can be so messy and so different, what's the one thing we should actually be focusing on? And Paul answers that by pulling the camera way, way back.
He gives us a universal principle that applies to literally everyone, no matter who you're married to, what your job is, or where you come from.
And it is the core idea. Verse 17 states the principle: only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him. Then, in verses 18 and 19, he takes a huge cultural marker of the time, circumcision, and basically says it means nothing. What really matters? Well, as this compass shows, the only true north is keeping the commandments of God. Your external labels just don't matter as much as your internal obedience.
He then applies this to the most extreme social status imaginable. Verse 20 sets the rule: each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Then, from verse 21 to 23, he applies this to slavery and offers this mind-bending paradox. A slave who is called by God is the Lord's freed person. And a free person? Well, they're Christ's slave. Your spiritual identity completely flips your earthly one on its head. Verse 24 just sums it all up. Whatever your situation was when you were called, just stay there with God.
So after establishing that massive principle, Paul zooms the camera back in. Now he's applying it directly to the unmarried, especially because of what he calls the present distress.
In verses 29 to 31, he gives this radical, almost shocking mindset for living in turbulent times. His whole logic is, the time is short. So what does that mean for how we live? It means we should hold everything in this world, our marriage, our deepest emotions, our stuff, with a really light touch. This isn't a call to be heartless, but to live with an eternal perspective, because as he says, the form of this world is passing away.
And this brings us to the why behind his advice, which he lays out from verse 32 to 34. And you know what? It all comes down to focus. An unmarried man or woman is concerned with the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But a married person, and this is totally normal, is concerned with worldly things, like how to please their spouse. Their interests are divided. So for Paul, the big advantage of being single is having an undivided devotion.
Now, in verses 36 to 38, Paul gets into a really specific cultural question, probably about a father's responsibility for his unmarried daughter. And his conclusion is super nuanced. He says if the father gives her in marriage, he does well, but the father who helps her stay single so she can be devoted to God, he does better. It just reinforces his main theme. Marriage is good, but in these specific circumstances, singleness can actually be better.
And that brings us right to the end of the chapter. Paul offers one last concise ruling that kind of sums up his whole perspective on the lifelong commitment of marriage.
Verse 39 lays it out plain and simple. The marriage bond is for life. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But death, like this visual of the cut rope, it unties that knot. If her husband dies, she is completely free to get remarried, but there's one critical condition. Her new husband must be in the Lord, another believer.
And in classic Paul fashion, he ends with his personal judgment in verse 40. And I love how humble he is, saying he thinks he's also guided by the Spirit of God. In his opinion, a widow will actually be happier if she stays single. It's not a command, just one last piece of wisdom from his own experience.
So there you have it. A detailed, practical, and sometimes pretty surprising set of answers to some of life's biggest questions. Yeah, it was written for a specific group of people at a specific time, but those underlying principles about our relationships, our purpose, and our focus, they still challenge us. The real question now is, what do these ancient words mean for our very modern lives?